Hi, my name is Stephanie Rodenberg Lewis. I am a licensed professional counselor as well as a registered play therapist. I'm also currently a doctoral student working on my PhD in infant and early childhood mental health. This past weekend, I had the opportunity to present at Breakthrough T1D here in Houston and talk about the parent child relationship and its impact on type 1 diabetes. Since the event was not live streamed, I decided that I would go ahead and record this presentation and upload it for public viewing. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so briefly, we will go over the agenda for this recording. Again, as I mentioned, this was originally a presentation. And so we began with a reflective exercise talking about the effects of angels and ghosts in the nursery. We then looked at parenting styles. And then we started to talk about how all of these things tie into type 1 diabetes management. Next, we took a look at some of the current research out there. And then we talked a bit more in depth about the parent child relationship, its direct impact on diabetes management. We also talked about the parent child mentalization process and why that matters as a parent. And then finally, we discussed ways to foster and facilitate the parent child relationship and the outcomes that that can have on the type 1D family. So, just a little about me. As I mentioned, I am a therapist and have been so since 2018. I've been living with type 1D for over 40 years, and I'm also the proud mom of a son living with type 1D. I am also currently a doctoral student, as I mentioned, and I have been working and doing a deep dive on the research that's currently out there on type 1 and mental health, as well as possible dissertation topics on type 1 and mental health. So I'm always very open about my own mental health challenges as a teenager. And I quickly realized that there's just not enough mental health resources available for the type 1 community. In fact, I had the opportunity to speak a few years ago before the Texas Diabetes Council, specifically on type 1 and mental health. So, all of this has brought me to a point where I realized that we need to have more mental health services that are tailored for the type 1 community. It's my hope that as we continue to talk about mental health challenges of those people living with type 1, as well as the families, that we can continue to advocate for more services for our type 1 families. Okay, so again, this was originally a presentation in a group setting with a group of people. However, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to pause and reflect. And so I want to invite you to think about who was someone that you turned to when you were scared as a child, or perhaps when you were hurt or sick. Who was the person that was there to comfort you, to take care of you, to make you feel safe and seen? And likewise, on the opposite spectrum, I want you to consider times when you felt like perhaps you weren't seen or you went unnoticed. And so I'll pause here for just a moment as you reflect on those questions. And so the reason for taking a few moments to do that is because of a concept known as angels in the nursery and ghosts in the nursery. And so to briefly discuss those concepts, angels in the nursery is a term that comes from developmental psychology that refers to our nurturing experiences that we had as a child with caregivers during our early years. And so, what we now know is that these experiences create emotional blueprints, if you will, that can promote resilience and secure attachment later in life. And so, I always tell people that it is my hope that you had at least one angel and possibly more. Again, thinking about those people that created that resilience and secure attachment for you. And likewise, on the opposite spectrum, we also have ghosts in the nursery. And this is a term that comes from psychoanalytic and developmental theory and talks about how our unresolved traumas, fears, or negative experiences from our own past can unconsciously affect our interactions with our child. And so these ghosts are the emotional and behavioral legacies of earlier generations. And it can impact our parenting, often in ways that caregivers may not fully realize. So this may very well be, and is most likely, an unconscious process. And so, as I mentioned, why do these things matter? So often we are reenacting these unconscious patterns of behavior in our own parenting. And so most of us have heard of the term generational trauma. And this is really how generational trauma is passed down. And we often think that this is just how things are in our family. So I hope that as you think about the angels and ghosts in your past, that you may see directly how those impacted you and shaped how you were growing up, and now how you parent if you choose to parent. So let's go ahead and transition now and talk briefly about parenting styles. So there are four main parenting styles that we currently recognize. The first one is authoritarian, and I feel like this is the one that most people are familiar with. So, authoritarian is a highly punitive type of parenting where there are strict rules and guidelines, very high expectations, and a lack of flexibility. So, these are the parents that will say, "Because I said so." They expect immediate and blind obedience from the child without taking the child into consideration. The next style of parenting is what we refer to as authoritative. So, authoritative parenting has more warmth and flexibility. It does still have boundaries in place. This means that the parent will listen to the child's opinion, but the parent is still the ultimate decision maker, and that there are clear expectations so children know what is expected of them. Next, we have the permissive style of parenting, and I know many people are familiar with this one as well. We may identify this parent as being their child's friend. There are low expectations on the child, and there is warmth and nurturing with open communication. And finally, the last parenting style is neglectful. And this is where the child's basic needs are met, but little else attention is paid to the child. There are few limitations or expectations for the child, and there is a lack of nurturing. And so, what does all of this have to do with type 1 diabetes and type 1 diabetes management? Well, we know a few things about type 1 diabetes, and one of those things is that a chronic illness impacts the parent child relationship. So we know that parents are often bearing the weight of their child's complex medical needs, which can lead to feelings of hopelessness, distress, and create strain on the parent child relationship. We also know that chronic illness impacts parents' mental health. So again, as we mentioned, that parents are often bearing the weight of the child's medical needs. This can create ongoing anxiety about their child's health, as well as their future and quality of life. These increased caregiving demands can also lead to emotional exhaustion and burnout. We know that chronic illness impacts the family dynamic. If you speak to a family, they will likely share with you that everyone in the family has been impacted by the disease in one way or another. So we know that when we speak with siblings, grandparents, for example, they all have their own unique perspectives of how type 1D has impacted their family dynamics. And then finally, we know that chronic illness increases the risk for mental health disorders. So our type 1s are at a higher risk for anxiety and depression, as well as disordered eating patterns and diabetes burnout. So now I'd like to take a moment and talk a little bit about what the research is currently telling us. So I had the opportunity to do some really deep dives into some of these topics. And some of the information was a little bit surprising. And so I want to make sure that we take a few minutes to review that. So we have discovered that effective management of type 1 requires the collaboration between parents and children. And we understand this again, depending on the age of the child, of course, the management and this collaboration will look different. But regardless, it has the opportunity to go either way. It can either strengthen the parent child relationship or it can strain the parent child relationship. And so we know that parents play a crucial role in facilitating their child's self management. And this is particularly during the teen years when the responsibility begins to shift more to the teen. So, conflict may exist between the parent and child when communicating about the daily demands of type 1. And so, effective communication strategies are essential. And parents often are navigating these complex emotions and stress on a daily basis. The presence of type 1 can lead to increased emotional stress within the family, affecting the quality of parent child interactions. High levels of perceived stress in adolescence correlate with poor diabetes self management, mediated by the quality of the parent child relationship. For younger children, the research shows an increase in childcare concerns, behavioral problems, and peer relationships as the primary stressors. So, what we are essentially saying is that if we can improve the relationship and strengthen the relationship between the parent and child, that this can positively affect that parent-child dynamic, which will then in turn also have an effect on type 1 management. And again, as we mentioned before, we know that the family environment is also impacted by type 1. And so when we look at parenting styles of parents with type 1 children, when mothers showed more emotional warmth, support, reasoning, and democratic participation in their child's illness, psychological outcomes improved. And while there were fewer studies looking at the father-child bond, they did show that when parents maintain the relationship, it positively influences parent-child relationship quality, reduces interparental conflict, and enhances the father-child bond. So, how does the parent-child relationship impact diabetes management? We now know that when we foster and strengthen the parent-child relationship, children have better psychological outcomes as well as better glycemic outcomes. So, I'd like to take a few moments here to talk a little bit about that process through something known as mentalization. And the mentalization happens between a parent and child beginning at a very young age. We're talking as young as infancy. And so, if you think about back when your child was an infant, you might think of an example where you smile at your child and they smile back. Okay. And your child learns that idea of cause and effect. They learn that when they show something, they receive something in return. And that's literally the moment that the parent child mentalization process begins. It becomes much more intricate over the next couple years. And what begins to happen is that a child begins to understand that they have their own separate mental state that is actually separate from the parent. However, it is initially the parent's mentalization process that helps the child learn how to organize and make sense of their internal world and experiences. So, if we think about that, essentially what we mean is that a child will see themselves the way that the parent sees them. And when you see and recognize your child, the child learns that they can trust themselves. And so, if we think about that in terms of disease management, how we see our child is the way that they see themselves. And again, this also impacts the way that they feel about their disease, the way they manage their disease. So that mentalization process, although it's happening irregardless of type 1 diabetes, it also impacts the process of how a child feels about their chronic illness. So, knowing all this information and understanding the importance of the parent child relationship, what can we do? First and foremost, we want to look at seeing the child before the condition. One thing to do is every so often, I suggest parents do a self audit where you review your conversations with your child. How much of your conversations center around disease management, around day to day type 1 tasks? And this is an opportunity for you to think about how you begin your conversations with your child. Are you first asking about them? Are you asking about their day, about something important to them? Or are you immediately going to the data, to the questions? Did you bolus? What's your blood sugar? Things like that. So, making sure that we are seeing the child before the condition. Next, we want to focus on the donut and not the hole. And what that means is it is very easy to notice deficits and notice problems. Okay. But as we mentioned in the previous slide, children begin to see themselves the way that we see them. So if we are always focused on their problems, then that is also what they are believing about themselves too. Next, be a thermostat, not a thermometer. You set the tone for your household. If you are anxious about type 1, your child will be anxious too. Okay. We understand that you are human and we understand that you have emotions about type 1. And that's why we also need to make sure that we're managing our own emotions and getting our own support as parents. But remembering that you set the tone for your household. Next, we want to talk about that rupture and repair is a normal, healthy part of attachment and part of relationship management. So, what you do is not as important as what you do after what you did. So, there are going to be times that you blow up. There are going to be times that you handle a situation and you wish you would have done something differently. That's when we can go back and work on repair. Not only is this part of healthy attachment, it also models for our children that we are not above apologizing or reflecting on our own behavior. Next, seeking your own support. As I mentioned, we have to be the thermostat. We need to tend to our own needs. And so, whether that's through individual therapy, a support group, or taking time for yourself, you cannot ignore your own needs. This is not selfish. And I always talk about the oxygen mask theory. We know that we have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before we put it on our child. And as a general rule, that's challenging when we are a parent. It is even more challenging when you are the parent of a child with a chronic illness. We often feel that we have to be doing it all at all times. However, you cannot give away that which you don't possess. If you are dysregulated, if you are struggling, we are setting the tone in our household. So it's okay to take a step back. In fact, we encourage it. Again, we model for our children that sometimes we need to take our own moment. We need to take a step back, and that's okay. When a child is drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. So when a child is upset, it's not the time to try to impart wisdom or teach a lesson. We know that oftentimes blood sugars impact cognitive function. Therefore, when your child is low, we want to use little to no language. They are not able to attend to what we're saying. It's the same thing when they are having chronic high blood sugar. It does impact their cognitive function, and this may not be the time to teach a lesson or try to impart some sort of wisdom. And finally, nothing is more important than my relationship with my child. So, how can you communicate with your child while preserving the relationship? Again, we want to make sure that we are focusing on the child before the illness. In summary, our parenting styles are formed by our ghosts and our angels, and you may find yourself parenting out of unconscious patterns. Authoritative parenting fosters warmth, independence, and emotional regulation in children and teens, which is what we want for all of our kids. Finally, there is growing evidence that certain parenting behaviors correlate with improvements in children's psychological health while managing type 1. We want to make sure that we remember to have our own support network as a parent, and again, remembering that oxygen mask analogy. And finally, rupture and repair is a natural part of a parent-child relationship. There's no such thing as a perfect parent, and there are times that you will miss the mark, and that's okay. And when you're unsure of what to say to your child, a question to ask yourself is, what action will most preserve the relationship or do the least harm? These are words to keep in the back of our head when we encounter a situation and we're unsure of what to say to our child. And I just want to end here with my contact information. If you have any information regarding support for type 1 children or family members, these are the ways that you can reach out and get a hold of me. And again, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to review this presentation. My hope is that we will continue to have these conversations and continue to recognize the impact that mental health has on our type 1 families. Thank you for watching.